2021 that I visited Sue, our host today, at Bear Park, just over in Dilworth Ave around the corner. And they'd asked me to come and visit as their local MP because, as they told me, they faced 303 regulations to open their door. They felt it was killing them and making it harder and harder to operate a centre. I got interested in this topic and I visited more ECEs over the years. I visited the Early Childhood Council pre-election forum, and I noticed that there was a sector of people who play a vital role in New Zealand society and economy. It's about $3.1 billion of taxpayer funding and a similar amount of fees paid by parents each year. But more important than the money is the role that early childhood plays in preparing the next generation of little Kiwis for when they take over running the show, and their preparation for school and the rest of their lives perhaps has a bigger multiplier on how our country turns out in the long term than nearly anything else. So this sector, I believe, is important. But as I look further into it, I found a group of largely people like Sue, small business owners, running centres, building fabulous facilities, taking good care of children, but besieged by multiple regulators with really unclear regulatory objectives and a calcified set of 98 licensing criteria that you're running, and if you break one, we can shut you down. And this is where the Ministry for Regulation's sector reviews come in. The Ministry, starting in June last year, spent 6 months and engaged with 2,300 different people and asked, from the point of view of someone running a centre, from the point of view of someone working in a centre, and the point of view of someone who sends their children to a centre, how are you finding the regulatory experience? And they found the complaints I've listed, high stakes, calcified licensing criteria, some really absurd practices which just made you shake your head when you heard what was actually going on and being visited on these operators, and a real sense of fear and anxiety that varied by the Ministry of Education's 12 regions. What was needed in the recommendations from the Ministry for Regulation were really three things. First of all, simplification and rationalisation of the rules. As a result of this review, Cabinet has agreed that over the next 6 months the Ministry of Education will implement a rationalisation of the licensing criteria, and while the exact outcome of that is not confirmed and won't be until September, in early indications from the Ministry for Regulation's report are that around 3/4 of the 98 licensing criteria will be changed, got rid of, or modified to allow everyone to get on better while emphasising student or child safety at the heart of everything that they do. The second thing, besides changing the licensing criteria themselves, is introducing a 5-step graduated intervention program, so that rather than showing up and saying, uh-oh, we're going to close you down, the regulator will come along and say, we believe that there's some things you're doing wrong, they're not critical yet, but we're going to help you comply before we rush to shutting down your centre by temporarily or permanently taking away your licence. So graduated proportional enforcement is the second thing after simplifying and streamlining the rules. The third thing is we're going to go to Parliament and change the Education Act so that there are clear principles and purposes for regulating that people can point to and say, this is what the Director of ECE regulation is here for, and this is what he or she should be upholding according to the law. Those principles will start right at the top with the children's safety. That always remains paramount. Also critical will be their preparation for the transition to school. But another critical criteria to be added is that there should not be regulation greater or more complicated than what's required to achieve student safety and preparation for school in a happy and educational environment. There's been a lot of speculation about Recommendation 10 from the Ministry for Regulation's report. That recommendation is to simplify the criteria around qualifications and employment. Some people have raised some anxiety that will somehow reduce the level of qualifications or skill of teachers in early childhood education centres. That is not the case. There will be some consideration starting in October of how the licensing criteria apply to qualifications, and that consideration will be finished in the first quarter of next year. However, our commitment is to make sure that for the budget available from both parents' pockets and the taxpayers' pockets, that we maintain a very high quality of qualified people in early childhood education centres. The only thing I should add before I turn it over to questions is that there will be a timeline from now where the licensing criteria will be completed and put in place by September. Legislation will be introduced to Parliament mid-year and passed by the end of the year, and next year the new criteria for regulating and graduated enforcement will be put in place in the first quarter. So overall it will be 2 years from go to woe, from when the Ministry for Regulation first went out and started asking people how can we do this better, to when they completed their report at the end of last year, to Cabinet adopting an implementation plan which happened 2 weeks ago, and the Ministry for Education implementing the plan to make sure that detailed new rules are put in place. By the end of that process, a group of educators have been besieged by outdated, complex regulations with multiple regulators will find a much simpler, more proportional, more supportive regulatory environment. It will take up less of their time on regulatory activity and more time focusing on children's safety and preparation for school. I hope that that's some helpful comments, but obviously it is quite a big topic, so happy to take more questions.
Can you give us an example of done regulation? Give us a couple.
Oh, look, the requirement to have exactly 18 degrees centigrade. Now, obviously, temperature is important to small children, but we know that children have existed for thousands of years, and they can take a degree or two either side. That is a rule that, depending on what sort of regulator you have, they can be really, really strict on or not care about. We want simpler rules, no specific temperature requirements like that, but actually a victory of common sense. I also just point out a number of rather strange things that have happened. We had one example where an early childhood centre regulator was required to write to KiwiRail to ask a train operator to stop honking their horn when the children went out to wave at the train. Now, there is no specific rule that requires anyone to do that, but it's an example of when you don't have clear rules and when you have high stakes, keep going or shut down licensing criteria, that a wayward regulator can really make an educator's life hell. What we're going to do is make sure, first of all, that in that scenario they'd only have a proportional set of interventions, and second of all, the regulator could point to the law and say, well, children's safety, children's education, and not introducing more rules than are required to uphold those. So.
Is it fair to say that it's mainly the operators wanting these changes rather than the parents? I mean, I see that you have the parents in the group.
Yeah.
Surely parents would be arguing for fewer sort of looser safety.
Well, parents don't directly see the interactions between the regulator and the centre, but they do see is there a supply of quality ECEs in their neighbourhood, and the harder you make the regulations, the less likely it is that you get more people stepping up to the plate to drive the sector forward and focus on the children's welfare. So while the parents may not directly be affected by the regulations, they do see the effects of it when there's less supply, less options and less choice.
But it is the operators
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the points of the Ministry for Regulation sector reviews is that we go to the regulated party. For too long, they haven't had a voice, and so they bear most of the costs. But of course, we know that if a business is regulated, all of its money comes from its customers. So ultimately, they pass that cost on, whether through taxes or through daycare fees.
There have been some reports of ECE outlets, some of them being unsafe and sort of getting away with things. I remember the shoulder with a large story for stock a few years ago. And I think a tree fell on top of an ECE just outside your elected office in Epsom.
I remember that, yeah.
I mean, what if people do say, actually, I think what we need is a tightening of regulation, then what really does amount a bit to release money?
Well, if you take the example of the tree falling, it's difficult to imagine what the Ministry of Education would have had to have done unless they're going to employ arborists and check every tree near an ECE anywhere in the country. I don't think that's practical. I think the real danger is that when you have a whole lot of rules that are unclear, you have big variations between different ministry regional offices, that's when real dangers can slip through the cracks. So I would just make the point that by saying, look, this is how you regulate, these are the principles, these are the rules, this is the graduated enforcement pathway, that's when you can really hone in on, well, what are the things that are truly dangerous that could happen to a child, and how do we ensure that those are focused on?
Sort of like a line drawn in the curiosity criteria, where if it's broken, they can still be looking at each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things. Obviously, for example, the worst thing that can happen in any centre is an adult deliberately harming a child. I mean, that's just totally unacceptable. But of course, it's also criminal. So yes, there are certainly things that are unacceptable in any circumstance. But at the moment, there's really no difference between something very, very serious that we must stop at all costs and something relatively minor that a regulator who's perhaps a bit out of control can use and abuse. And I take the case of Country Kindy in the Manawatu that was delicensed or risk delicensing for some months. Even as the Minister, I couldn't honestly tell you right now what they had done wrong. I visited the centre, it's a wonderful centre, and yet they faced months of turmoil, being in the news, risking their licence, a community uprising. The community loved them and were angry at the government for potentially shutting them down. And even as the Minister, I had very limited things I could do to help them. Now, if we put someone like that in the same category as somebody who, perhaps is truly endangering a child, then you actually miss out on both.
Can you clarify to me why a bill being passed is necessary yet for the regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the recommendations from the Ministry for Regulation's review was that we should pass a law so people can point to these are the things to worry about. The objectives are child safety number one, children's education and transition to school, and not making more rules than are necessary to achieve those objectives. Sometimes helpful. For example, in the case of Country Kindy, it might have been helpful for someone to be able to say, well, hang on a minute, Parliament has passed a law saying you, Mr. or Mrs. Regulator, have some responsibilities as well. So it's really about clarity of roles and responsibilities and ultimately rights rather than confusion.
Just lastly for me, does this sort of make the regulators and ECEs partners rather than opposition?
Yeah, I believe it's much more important that regulators are there to help people comply rather than punish them, especially punish them arbitrarily and unpredictably. So this with the graduated enforcement criteria, with the simpler rules and clear principles and purpose for regulating, I think we'll see a much more cooperative view. Because what I find, you go around the country, I just spoke to Amber, who operates this centre, and I said, well, how's your relationship with the ministry? She said, pretty good. I could take you to other parts of the country where they're basically at war with their local office. And so, this is about making sure that there's a clear understanding of what's really important for the regulator so that they can help the regulated party, the operator, comply.
On the staffing, is this a way of just reducing the wage bill, bringing in people on close to minimum wage, as long as you've got a boss who's qualified?
There's no current proposal to change the qualification requirements. It is true that about 80 to 90% of the costs at a centre like this go on wages. So, yes, it is a major cost, but you'll see at this budget we are again increasing the budget for ECE. If you talk to parents, they're paying an awful lot. I think what's important is that we make sure we're getting value for money, and that means the best ratios of the best qualified people that money can buy. What rules you put around that and how much judgment you give to the centre operator versus saying, look, someone with an architecture degree from Switzerland can come in here at the top of the scale, that I think is an open question. I believe that we have enough resource, but it's not being efficiently used at the moment. There's not enough clarity of purpose. Some of the rules are unnecessary and overly complicated. So really this is about how do we take the resources that we have and ensure that they're focused on child safety and child education rather than some of the other stuff that tends to just annoy people. In terms of cuts to the Ministry of Education, to the best of my knowledge, and I'd have to double check this, but I don't believe that there's been any reduction in the regulatory workforce for ECE. Sorry. I can tell you that the cabinet paper that went through cabinet a couple of weeks ago, these changes will be fiscally neutral. There will be a little bit of extra money put in to work through the transition to new rules. So we're certainly not reducing the money available for regulating. We are focusing the resource on what we believe is more important. Well, it certainly remains a policy. In terms of whether people can access it or end up paying top-up fees, I think some parents would question that. But 20 hours free ECE remains the government's official policy, yes. Yeah. So, strictly speaking, we are waiting for the final review of the 98 licensing criteria that will be finished in September. So this is an ongoing process. We're basically at half time here. There's another year of change to go. However, I would expect those rules would be gone. For example, the requirement for every centre to keep vaccine records. Well, the Ministry of Health's been keeping those records for the last 15 years, so it's a needless duplication. It's not obvious why they have to keep them or who would access them. Yeah. Okay.
Could you outline 15 changes?
If you want me to do all 15 in a row, I might not get them 15 out of 15. But look, very simply, we're simplifying the overly complex 98 licensing criteria. We're making sure that the enforcement is graduated, so it goes from warning to closure in 5 steps instead of, you're okay, you're shut. And we're going to legislate the principles so that everyone involved can say Parliament has made a law to say what the rules are, and that will all be rolled out over the year from now. So within 2 years of this starting, the ECE sector will have a totally new set of rules and a totally new relationship with the regulator, and I think that will allow a lot more time to go into children's safety and education, less time on paperwork. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. I don't know if you've got any other questions but about other topics, but I'm here if you want me. Otherwise, we'll see if we can't get some B-roll. So, yeah. well, he doesn't have the power to do that. The government, of course, has a budget coming up and has to make decisions about all funding line items. RNZ is one of those, but it's actually under the portfolio of arts, culture and heritage. So the person to announce anything like that, if there was anything like that, would actually be Paul Goldsmith. So.
So what do you make that you hear of them?
Well, frankly, I think it reflects enormous frustration that people have with media and perhaps with politicians. I just give you this example. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I do public meetings somewhere in New Zealand several times a week. In the last 5 Sundays, or the 5 Sundays before last Sunday, I was doing 7 street corner meetings in different street corners around Epsom, so I had 35 and 5 Sundays. And I would say probably of those 35, at 25 of them, people would have brought up their concerns with and distrust in media. Now you could say, well, these people went to a David Seymour street corner meeting. Of course they're going to say that. But, this is, there's a lot of other topics they could raise. And that's probably one of the most frequent topics. So, I think there has to be some alertness that is a concern that people have out there. But ultimately you just got to work through these things and say, does one minister have the ability to unilaterally defund RNZ? Well, even the Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage would have to get the entire cabinet to agree on that decision, and I don't believe that the government is going to take that position.
It's a pretty outrageous thing to throw it up there, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately people calibrate themselves for different politicians' remarks, and I guess maybe that remark will help with your calibration.
I think people discuss politicians more than they discuss the media, though, don't they?
Is that what's your source for that?
Well,
I hope that's true, because otherwise you might lose more trust.
the latest information I've seen.
Yeah, is that there was a trust survey that came out recently? Have you overtaken us?
No, I'm saying that they distrust you more than they distrust the media.
Yeah, certainly. I've seen both our professions competing for the wooden spoon in these surveys over the years I've been involved in this business. I think the point is that there's no point trying to say that you're worse or they're worse. I just make the case that a lot of people, have real concerns, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and rebuild that, because the Elizabethan age, as some people call it, the sort of 60s, 70s through to a few years ago, was generally speaking a good time in New Zealand, and we want to keep that going.
Don't you think, though, that this, I mean, one of the reasons politicians do lose trust in some cases is because they introduce bills like the one that Mr. David was discussing at first, which is of a minor, comprehensive cultural issue that when there are so many pressing issues in this country.
Well, perhaps, but also, there are a group of New Zealanders for whom this is a legitimate concern, and I think as an elected representative, I think it's Jenny Marcroft as the MP, has a right to introduce a bill. What's interesting is it's attracted so much coverage, which perhaps reflects that there is public interest, or at least that people are clicking on your articles when you report on it. So I don't know, who do we blame here? The politician who put up the bill, the journalist who wrote the story, or the citizen who clicked on it? I think that's precisely the debate. How do you reconcile different human rights? On the one hand, the right of a person to identify as they see fit. On the other hand, the right of another person to say, this is my identity, and it has certain vital criteria that you can't claim unless you have them. So this is actually a trade-off between two human rights, and it's worthy of debate. Well, exactly, and that's, I think, if we enter into that spirit, we'll actually get more progress. But if you want to know why I think there's a lack of trust, I mean, for the last 80 or so years, politicians across the Western world have said, look, the basic deal is if you give us a third to half of your income in taxes, we will solve the problems and give everyone a good and equal life. And people have looked at that, they've paid their money, and I'm not just talking income taxes, I'm talking rates, I'm talking GST, and they've said, okay, we paid the money, but if anything, our social problems seem to be as bad, if not worse than ever. So, that I believe is at the core of why people are less trusting. However, in my own small way, we are seeking to make the regulatory system around early childhood education more partnering, more cooperative, so that people can get down to the business of using that money that comes from parents and from taxpayers, sometimes the same people at once, in order to prepare the next generation of young Kiwis for when they take over running this great country. Right. There you go. Good fun.